think he should be punished? Yes and no. Yes, because in my panic, I lied and I destroyed evidence. But no, not for her murder. And I'll accept punishment for her death, but not for her murder. I would understand a penalty for her death because it happened and because I played a major part in it. So I don't really believe that I'm guilty of murder.
Westminster Police hoping you can help find this missing 19-year-old. She's Leah Charlie Porter. She lives in Pueblo, but she was in Westminster last Thursday when she went missing. Now take a look. Porter's hair is dyed blonde, but she has brown hair. She also has a tattoo on her wrist and her lower lip is pierced. You can call Crime Stoppers or Westminster if you have any information to help find her.
How many years did you know him total?
He was only an acquaintance to me, just someone I knew at school, you know. I didn't really, he was creepy to me. I heard that he had thoughts of raping and killing a certain girl while he was in high school.
When you described Chris as being creepy in high school and weird, can you describe, the creepiness?
He looked frustrated with himself all the time. He would get frustrated with girls because in his head they would be flirting with him. And I talked to everybody I went to school with, not once. Nobody flirted with him. Not one person.
Knowing that Christopher Wade had some very dark and particularly sadistic urges and fantasies as young as teenage life in high school would be reason for any parent to be concerned. And Max Porter, because he went to school with Wade and was aware of these rumors, he's understandably really worried about his sister.
She said she was tired and she just wanted to crash, so I said okay. And I found some of her drugs and confronted her about it that night. Then shortly afterwards, she took off. And I didn't really think much of it. I thought she was just angry at me because I was playing the part of a concerned friend. Overall, she seemed pretty depressed, and while she was smiling, it didn't really go to her eyes. So that kind of was weirding me out to see her like that.
Wade presents here as somebody who's really nervous. His answers almost seemed like they were written for him. Like he's thought about what he was going to say and he's going by a script. Very stilted, very uncomfortable. And he drops comments here and there, almost comments like he thinks he should say. Like he was concerned about her drug addiction. He found drugs. She seemed depressed. But there's really not a lot of emotion behind what he's saying. It's almost to me like he's more concerned about saying the right thing during this interview than he is about not knowing where his friend is.
What are your concerns right now as a friend?
Well, overall, I just want her to be safe. I don't really have very many friends, but the friends I do have, I'm very loyal to. So even losing one is a heavy blow for me.
Refers to having already lost a friend. This has been also seen in other cases where people make a slip. It does raise their suspicion. Some people would say that's due to what we call the guilty knowledge in our head, and that it influences the way we think and the way we speak. And he probably didn't intend to say it that way, but you can probably believe it's true. He's already lost that friend.
You seem really shaken right now.
Yeah, it's definitely intimidating because I'm more of the person to listen and not speak. So with everyone trying to get in touch with me and ask me what happened, it's kind of, it's been a real sort of shock to my system. Overall, I'm not really handling the situation very well. So far, I was told that I'm not a suspect, but I just want to be as cooperative as possible to make sure that, I stay that way.
He's expressing a concern that the reason he's cooperating with police is because they're telling him he's not a suspect, and he wants to make sure he continues to control that narrative and ensure that he stays off their radar. But what Wade's engaging in is constant impression management. The problem is he doesn't think quickly on his feet, and when it's not rehearsed, you see these awkward behaviors and these cognitive leaks come out in the media interview.
We want to just talk to everybody that, has ever possibly known her, had any relationship with her. Can you fill me up in a little bit of Christopher's history growing up? How did he do in high school?
He kind of struggled in high school. He... not really withdrawn. He's a different thinker. Growing up, his dad was into pornography. And Chris found it online at a very young age. Chris was pretty messed up with it in high school.
Okay.
I found he stashed pictures of every sort. It made me sick. I heard things from, the principal called me one day and said he had touched a girl inappropriate at school.
What we now understand about pornography addiction and the influence of pornography exposure on young children as their brains are developing and their sexual identity is developing is that it sets up an expectation around sexuality, intimacy, and interacting with sexual partners that's highly unrealistic. And what also seems quite clear is that there were early warning signs, and his family chose to minimize the seriousness of those.
Now, what about, does he confide in you with any specific fantasies that you would be concerning?
I have to tell you.
I would really appreciate it.
He said that he went out one night, and we didn't know it. And he went to some girl's trailer.
Yeah.
We live out in the mountains. And so he walked over there and went in with the intention of kidnapping her and taking her out in the woods.
Do you think he actually did that?
I don't know. I didn't think so, but he told me that he did a couple of times. He told me that he went to her trailer in the middle of the night and that he was going to kidnap her, but the dog started barking or something, and so he got scared and left.
Here we have Wade's own mother confirming the rumors and the other perceptions that Leah's family has about him. When you think about these red flags of not only express sexual fantasies, violent, deviant fantasies, but also actual behavior where he enacted some of those fantasies. When you take that with what we have in this current situation where he's being investigated for a missing woman, it certainly is very concerning when you think about all the history that we have thus far.
But since he's gotten out of high school, he's gotten himself on a really good track, and he went into the Army. He did some deployment time. He started having nightmares in deployment, and they sent him back.
For psychiatric reasons?
Yes.
Was he diagnosed with anything?
No.
the psychological evaluation from the United States Army that was done in preparation for Wade's discharge paints a very different picture than what his mother wants to believe or what he maybe told her. Wade was quite forthcoming with the doctor that he has ongoing urges and fantasies of raping a specific classmate. And what the doctor ultimately says, which is both alarming and quite astute, is that while there's no evidence that Wade has harmed anybody, he's dangerous, he has the potential for dangerousness.
What's your gut feeling? You're his mom.
About Leah is I totally believe that he has not done anything.
I want you to understand that you're not in custody, that we're focusing in on you to make an arrest or something like that. That's not the case.
Okay. I know that much.
You understand that?
Yeah, I'm studying criminal justice. So I kind of know how these things sort of work.
Okay.
Learning about a lot of this stuff in class.
In this particular scene where he's being interviewed by the police and they're going, oh, I do, criminal justice. So a way of saying, I'm kind of like you. Like, we have something in common. It's his effort to control the image of him in the police's eyes, to make him look like he's cooperative, he's on board, he's a good person. It's part of his image of being the helpful friend.
When you talked to our officers on the 5th, which was, you think, last Thursday, what did the cops tell you?
They got my statement. They were asking me, what happened. And there wasn't anything new, so they were just calling me to try and get it straight from the horse's mouth of the facts. I know I talked to Lee's mom, Renee, as well as her brother, Max. I think he was skeptical because he thought I had done something, but...
Why do you say that?
Just in his mannerisms, it seemed like he was under the impression that I was since I was the last person to see her, that I therefore must be the person that did something to her. I told him that I did a tarot reading for her, but I didn't learn anything of where she might be from it, so I didn't think it was important.
You did a tarot reading while she was with you?
Yes.
Or before she left? Or after she left?
While she was with me. I treated her out to lunch. I was being as courteous as possible to her. But throughout the whole time, the smiles never went to her eyes. Amy. Well, normal smiling will cause the eyes to start to crinkle a little bit, to squint. But when she was smiling, it was just with her mouth. There wasn't any eye movement. That tells me that she was telling the truth when she was depressed. But now that I think about it, this might have been that she didn't like lying to me.
Here, Wade is almost presenting himself like he's an expert in behavioral analysis and almost teaching the investigators about what a real smile looks like and how he's able to discern when she's telling him the truth or not. He wants them to believe that he knows more than he really does and that he's a different person than he really is. He's lying and manipulating.
And then afterwards, she just asked, I'm tired, can I just pass out for a while? And then about, an hour and a half after, that was when my roommate came back home. Well, for the most part, she was asleep in my bed. And I started thinking, and she had that bag with her that she didn't let leave her side.
And in fact, you later looked in that bag.
Yes.
Or what did you see?
Afterwards, I saw her drug paraphernalia. I woke her up very gently. Yeah, I apologized to her because I had looked into the bag.
What was her response to you violating her privacy?
I think she understood where I was coming from because, as I told her, I was worried about her. And not because I have any sort of physical or emotional attraction to her. I wouldn't mind if something like that developed in the future. And I made sure that she understood that I was not angry with her for doing it or using, but that I was disappointed that she didn't come forward with that to me. I mean, she was annoyed, yes, but not irritated.
We see this parent-child judgmental quality in Wade's attitude time and time again. What we also need to pay attention to is that, consistent with what we see with psychopathic offenders oftentimes, is this shallow affect. There's this shallowness to his emotions. They're superficial. He's using all these flowery words as if he's rereading a script that he's worked out in his head that is gentle and soft and almost romantic in nature. And yet, the words and content he's describing is an ugly confrontation about drug paraphernalia. And the two just don't add up.
Well, Chris, I'm going to ask you flat out right now. Do you know where Leah is? Did you do something to her?
I did nothing to her beyond what I've already said. And honestly, I have no idea where she is. A lot of things that could have happened. To me, the most logical things are that she took the advice from my tarot reading beyond the level that I intended. Or that she is just has fallen back into using drugs, and that she is ashamed to talk to people right now.
Explain to me how you ended up doing a tarot reading for her.
After I laid out the cards, the first thing that popped out to me were that there were 3 of the major arcana. Those indicate something significant. I explained the combination for the Ace of Wands and the High Priestess. The 3 of Cups is representative of something to be celebrated. So overall, there was nothing to me, as far as the tarot card reading, to indicate any sort of physical harm to her.
Okay. What else did you tell her that the cards showed?
Overall, I told her that this was one of the more optimistic readings that I had ever done.
But are you encouraging her to start a new life?
I encouraged her more off of the death side to, trim the tree and, take a close look at her life and to trim off what was being a bad influence.
So the part that makes no sense is he's just said to the police, maybe she took the intent of my reading too far. But when he's explaining the reading, it's supposed to be a joyous, celebratory thing. There's nothing malevolent in the reading that says, like, die, hurt yourself, bad things coming up. She's off celebrating, or she's in a good space, which is really incongruous. Why would you be worried? So the police have a right to be suspicious of it.
Once she got in that truck and left your parking lot, you had not
That was
seen
the
her
last
since.
I have seen her.
So is there any reason why we would find Lee's blood in your apartment? according to your report?
Well, when we were starting to get a little more physical, we accidentally bumped into each other. We had a nosebleed. I didn't really think much of it at the time, so after she got up, I cleaned up the little bit of a mess. I mean, it wasn't a major gusher, it was just a couple of drops.
We see Wade stumble here. He didn't expect law enforcement to kind of confront him about some of the blood evidence, to confront him and push him, and because he hadn't thought about that, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. He didn't have an explanation, but it is also important to note the ease with which he just makes something up, and that kind of pathological, compulsive ability to lie and just fill in the blanks is something we consistently see time and time again in psychopathic offenders.
Where are your sheets and your pillow?
My pillows are currently on my bed. As far as the sheets, I have no clue. Checking stuff in the laundry pile isn't something you really remember all that much, so it was routine.
You didn't get rid of the sheets?
No.
It seems inconsistent to us based on the condition of your apartment that you would be all of a sudden in the middle of a sexual experience taking your sheets and taking them off the bed.
Let's face it, your apartment's not exactly the tidiest. Okay.
I'd be the first to admit that.
It just doesn't make sense.
Honestly, when you put it that way, it doesn't really make much sense to me either. Two words that would describe me almost perfectly would be unorthodox and weird. And I'll straight up admit it that I'm probably one of the weirdest guys most people would probably know.
The only thing we ask is to tell us the truth. What's the deal with the sheets?
Alright, yeah, I did get rid of them.
Her cell phone ended up at the same place the sheets did at the dump.
I do not know. Honestly, I saw her leave with her cell phone.
How do you know she left with the cell phone?
This is the time for you to be honest with her.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the right words because I know that I have been untruthful. I'll straight up admit it, it bugs me to hell that I have been. But yes, her phone was with the sheets.
They're throwing out information that they don't yet really have, like her cell phone was found, right, with her clothing. And you hear Wade sigh. He's got to come up with a new story. And he goes, no, I saw her leave with her cell phone. But then you hear him sigh again. He's working really hard at trying to figure out. So when he then finally says, I'm searching for the right words, I believe him. He's trying to figure out what is the best way I can frame this.
Is she lying in the dump somewhere?
God, no. That's something I've had nightmares about. Hearing that she's been found somewhere in a dump someplace. I really do not want that for her.
So where is she?
Honestly, I do not know. She left and got into the truck.
Chris, this is a place where you need to tell us what happened to Lee.
Am I being accused of something?
What do you think?
It sounds to me like yes. And I maintain my innocence, but I would like a lawyer.
Yes, I'd like to confess to a murder.
Okay. What happened?
The case is into the disappearance of Lee Porter.
Ma'am? What? Can you take a deep breath? What's your name? My little baby. What are you calling about? That guy just admitted he killed my daughter.
The last couple days, we've been playing buddy-buddy with him over text, trying to make him think that we didn't think he did it. We got him to meet up with us to do a tarot card reading for my sister. And then I told him, I was like, I know you know where my sister is. And then he looked in my eyes and he said, I know.
Chris. I know.
Look at me right in my eyes. Dude, where is she?
Okay, look, and you have every right to be angry with me for lying to you. And I will be going forward with the police about this. I haven't yet because I'm trying to find the right way to do it.
This is the right way right
now. Yeah, I know. But what I say right now, it's going to be very hard. But until I come forward with them to it, it'll be within the week, I swear to you. But I'm gonna have to ask you to keep it to yourselves until then.
A great moment where you get a peek sort of into thinking of a psychopath who is self-absorbed. And he keeps saying, I know this is gonna be hard for you to hear. It's not really empathetic. His expectation is they should accept it on his terms. But that's the manifestation of control that you do see with psychopaths. They want to be in charge of the information and in control of other people's feelings about it.
Tell me right now what happened to my sister. You know what happened to my sister.
She wasn't yelling, but she was very venomous. And she grabbed the knife that I keep by my bed. And when we go back, I can show it to you. She grabbed it and pulled it out and tried to attack me.
She wouldn't do that, dude. She wouldn't do that, Chris. Stop lying.
Then after I was coherent enough to start functioning again, I'll admit it, I wasn't rational, and I did things that I should not have with what happened next. And I swear I didn't tie her up. I put the 2 trash bags underneath because after I got rid of her, I didn't want the smell to attract anyone. They were those odor control trash bags. I put a bag over her head, and then I placed 2 on top of her. I know you won't believe me, but I will be turning myself in to the police. I will tell them.
No, you're going to jail right now. You're going to prison right now. Call the cops.
What were the verbal threats she made to you?
She kept on saying, I need the drugs, you have to get them for me. And if you don't, then I'm going to cut you.
But she actually used the words, I'm going to cut you?
Yes. I'm sure she intended to, based off of the acidity in her voice, I'm sure she intended on very deep wounds.
At what point did she grab this knife?
It was shortly after she had threatened to come here to the police station to report that I had raped her.
He's now tossed in the word rape, and he's now woven it into the story to make him the victim, that he was going to be accused of rape, and that he was defending himself. But he, in the story, is the victim. It's consistent with how he's tried to represent himself all the way along.
She grabbed the knife, and she started thrusting it at me. It was overhand, straightforward. I dodged the first one, and the second time I grabbed her hand and spun her around so that her body was between the knife and myself. And I placed my hand right at her throat. And then after a while, it was just like a rubber band snap. Her muscles went lax all of a sudden, and I wasn't expecting it, so I jerked it and it cut her along her sternum.
And now see, when you first started telling us this, you didn't mention anything about her saying that she was going to come here and report that you raped her.
I'm sorry for that. I thought I had told that to you when I was saying, or initially describing what had happened. So that was my mistake, and I apologize for that.
Even at this point in the investigation, when he is clearly at the end of his rope, he's still not able to say, I murdered her, I'm responsible for her death. He just says, I played a major role in it. And that lack of responsibility taking is something that we see time and time again in psychopathic individuals. It's everybody else's fault but theirs, or it's a misunderstanding.
Did you have sex with her after she was dead?
No. Ew. That's not even in anything of my fantasies even. And my fantasies from high school had gone pretty dark, and that wasn't even in there.
You say that's not part of your fantasies. What are your fantasies?
I would rather not answer that. But suffice to say that they were not that dark.
What we know from the investigation is that we have a person who engaged in quite a bit of deviant sexual fantasies, urges, and to some degree, behaviors. No less than 21,000 images found on his computers and various hard drives that would be identified as possible child pornography. You start to look at all these things that are found in Wade's history. We realize this is somebody who has escalating deviant urges that are sadistic in nature. And when you couple that with the impulse control issues, this is a very dangerous individual.
Do you think what you did was wrong?
I'm not going to judge it right or wrong, but I do regret what I did, and I keep wishing that I could go back and do it over again to try and keep that from happening.
Do you think you should be punished?
Yes and no. Yes, because in my panic, I lied and I destroyed evidence. But no, not for her murder. And I'll accept punishment for her death because it happened and because I played a major part in it. So I don't really believe that I'm guilty of murder.
What caused her death?
Me. By choking her.
Okay, did you talk to our police dispatcher?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Would it surprise you that exactly what you said is, I would like to confess to a murder? That's exactly what you said, because I heard the recording.
If it's on the recording, then I must have.
Okay, but that's what you did?
I did not murder her.
Again, we see the I know better. Let me discuss the semantics of her death versus murder. There is such a heightened level of grandiosity that's on display here, and also a failure to accept responsibility. So we know that individuals with psychopathy often will find other reasons to justify their behavior. So maybe in his mind, murder is just coldly killing someone without any provocation, and he's still somehow trying to hang on to this idea that he was just defending himself against her.
I just want to give you the opportunity to add whatever you want to.
It's just that overall, I live my life as not really emotionless as possible, but not very touchy-feely either. It's not that I don't feel emotion, but I keep a very tight rein on it. And at my grandmother's funeral, I probably cried maybe 4 or 5 tears total. But I keep a tight chain on it. Because about the only emotion that I find any sort of value in is loyalty to friends, to family, stuff like that.
It's interesting and really speaks to a lack of self-awareness that he talks about the thing he values most and the emotion he values most is loyalty. He talks about to friends, and we know from the investigation he really doesn't have any. So what I think he's really talking about is loyalty to himself. He's betrayed himself. He's told on himself. He didn't handle this the way he thought he would. And any suggestions of regret really seem to be more about the fact that he's gotten caught.
Developing right now, the search tonight for the body of Lee Porter. Her high school friend is sitting behind bars linked to her murder. Christopher Wade turned himself in to Westminster Police last night. Now the suspect is in jail on charges of sexual assault and murder. Police searched his apartment twice and today sectioned off part of a public landfill in connection with the case.
Is there anything that you would like to request right now from us before we go through that process?
I have no other requests to make other than you keep in mind my decision not to lead an overly emotional life.
So in 2022, almost 8 years sort of after being in prison, Christopher Wade decides to write a letter describing the events of what took place on that day when he killed Leah. And it's not sent to anyone in specific, it's just sent to the court. In the letter, he goes into quite a bit of detail about the events that occurred that day that I think are in many ways illustrative of what goes on in the mind of a psychopath in terms of the use of other people. What Wade writes in the letter is that when Leah was there, she went into the bathroom. There was never any episode of doing a tarot reading for her. There was never an episode of her wanting drugs and trying to hold him hostage with a knife.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a street long after midnight, the kind that feels almost deliberate, as if the houses themselves are holding their breath. On Cromwell Street, in the city of Gloucester, that silence once wrapped itself around a narrow, unremarkable terraced house, number 25. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place. The windows were ordinary. The paint was aging but intact. A front door like any other, opening and closing as people came and went. Neighbors passed by without a second glance, sometimes offering polite nods, sometimes not even that. But silence, when it lingers long enough, begins to conceal more than it protects. If you had walked past that house in the late 1970s or early 1980s, you might have heard laughter spilling faintly through the walls. Children's voices. A radio humming somewhere in the background. The clatter of dishes. The rhythms of domestic life. A family, it would seem, living within its means, navigating the small, quiet struggles that define ordinary existence. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing alarming. And yet, beneath the floorboards, beneath the worn carpets and the furniture arranged with casual care, something else was waiting. Something buried not just in soil, but in secrecy so complete that it reshaped the very meaning of home. This is the story of that house. This is the story of Fred West and Rose West. And this is the story of how evil can wear the most familiar face. Because what makes this case so unsettling isn't only what happened inside those walls. It's how long it went unnoticed. How ordinary it appeared. How easily horror blended into routine until it became indistinguishable from it. Imagine a young woman walking alone at dusk. The air is cool, the sky dimming into that muted shade between blue and black. She's tired, maybe a little lost, maybe just trying to find somewhere to stay for the night. She passes rows of houses that all look the same, brick facades, narrow windows, curtains drawn against the evening. Nothing invites her in, but nothing warns her away either. Then a door opens. A voice calls out, casual, almost friendly. An offer of help. A place to rest. Maybe a meal. Maybe warmth. The kind of small kindness that can feel like salvation when you're vulnerable enough to need it. And she hesitates. Just for a moment. Because instinct is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It whispers, softly, almost apologetically. Something isn't right. Something feels off. But the voice at the door sounds normal. The face is calm, unthreatening. The house looks like every other house on the street. So she steps inside. The door closes. And the silence returns. Years later, when investigators would begin to uncover what had been hidden at number 25, they would struggle to reconcile the scale of the crimes with the banality of the setting. There were no towering gates, no isolated countryside, no dramatic signs of decay or madness. Just a family home in a working-class neighborhood. A place where children grew up. Where meals were shared. Where life, on the surface, moved forward like it did everywhere else. But surfaces can lie. Inside that house, the boundaries between normalcy and nightmare had long since collapsed. Rooms that should have offered safety became stages for control. Hallways that should have echoed with footsteps and conversation instead carried something heavier, something unspoken. The walls absorbed it all, layer by layer, year after year. And the ground beneath the house, the ground kept secrets. When the truth finally began to emerge in the early 1990s, it didn't come all at once. It rarely does. Instead, it surfaced slowly, painfully, piece by piece. A missing person here. A question there. A suspicion that refused to fade. And then, eventually, the kind of discovery that changes everything, not just for the people directly involved, but for an entire nation forced to confront what had been hidden in plain sight. Because this wasn't just a story about murder. It was a story about time. About how long something can remain buried before it is found. About how many chances there are for the truth to surface, and how easily those chances can be missed. And most of all, it was a story about people. The victims, young women and girls whose lives intersected, briefly and tragically, with a house that should never have become part of their story. Each of them had a past, a family, a future that stretched out ahead of them before it was abruptly cut short. They were not just names in a case file. They were daughters, sisters, individuals with hopes and fears and moments that mattered. But in the narrative that unfolded, their voices were often the quietest. Because the louder voices belonged to the ones who controlled the house. Fred West was, by most outward appearances, unremarkable. He could be friendly when it suited him, talkative even. The kind of man who blended easily into his surroundings. Someone you might pass on the street and forget moments later. There was nothing about him that demanded attention. And that was part of the danger. Rose West, on the other hand, carried a presence that people remembered differently. Some described her as cold. Others recalled flashes of temper, moments when something beneath the surface seemed to break through. But even then, those moments were often dismissed, explained away, folded back into the broader narrative of an unconventional but ultimately ordinary household. Together, they created something far more disturbing than either could have alone. A system. A pattern. A hidden world that operated behind closed doors, shielded by the assumptions people make about families, about homes, about what is and isn't possible in the spaces we consider safe. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with the crimes themselves, but with the illusion that allowed them to continue. Because if you ask the neighbors, many of them will tell you the same thing: they didn't know. They suspected, perhaps. They noticed things that didn't quite add up. A strange noise. A sudden disappearance. A tension in the air that was difficult to define. But nothing concrete. Nothing that could be pointed to with certainty. And certainty is what people wait for. Without it, doubt becomes easier than action. So life continued. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Children grew older. People moved in and out. The house remained, steady and unchanged, its exterior giving nothing away. And beneath it all, the silence deepened. Until, eventually, it couldn't hold any more. What makes this case linger in the mind isn't just the brutality of the crimes, though that alone would be enough. It's the proximity. The idea that something so extreme could exist so close to normal life, separated not by distance but by perception. A wall. A door. A decision not to look too closely. As we move deeper into this story, that tension will follow us. The contrast between what was seen and what was hidden. Between the life presented to the outside world and the reality that unfolded behind closed doors. Because the truth, when it finally came, did not arrive gently. It forced its way into the open, bringing with it questions that still echo today. How does something like this go unnoticed for so long? What allows it to continue? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how many other silences are still out there, waiting to be broken? The house on Cromwell Street is gone now. Demolished. Erased from the physical landscape as if removing it could somehow diminish what happened there. But places like that don't disappear so easily. They remain in memory, in records, in the stories we tell to try and understand them. And understanding, in cases like this, is never simple. Because there is no single moment where everything becomes clear. No instant where the pieces fall perfectly into place. Instead, there is only a slow, deliberate unfolding, a process of uncovering, layer by layer, what was hidden for so long. That is the journey we are about to take. Into a house that looked like every other house. Into a family that seemed, at least from the outside, like any other. And into a silence that, once broken, revealed something far darker than anyone had imagined. To understand how a place like number 25, Cromwell Street could exist as both a home and a grave, you have to step back, away from the headlines, away from the discoveries, and look at the world that surrounded it. Because nothing this extreme appears in isolation. It grows, quietly, in the spaces where attention falters and assumptions take root. In the decades following World War II, the city of Gloucester carried the slow, steady rhythm of a working-class English community rebuilding itself. Rows of terraced houses lined the streets, their brick faces weathered by time, their interiors shaped by practicality rather than comfort. Life here was not glamorous, but it was stable. People worked, raised families, and learned to mind their own business. Privacy was not just respected, it was expected. Cromwell Street fit neatly into that pattern. It was not a place people visited unless they had a reason. It was not picturesque or particularly memorable. It existed in that quiet middle ground of urban life where nothing remarkable was supposed to happen. The kind of street that faded into the background of a city's identity, known only to those who lived there. And yet, even in places defined by routine, there are always undercurrents. Small fractures beneath the surface. The occasional raised voice behind closed doors. The flicker of something unsettled that passes quickly enough to be dismissed. Number 25 stood among its neighbors without drawing attention. A narrow structure, modest and functional, with a small garden at the back that, over time, would take on a significance no one could have imagined. Inside, the layout was typical of its kind: cramped rooms, steep stairs, spaces that forced proximity between the people living within them. It was not a house designed for secrecy, and yet it became one. Before it became known for what was hidden beneath it, it was simply a home. And like any home, it was shaped by the people who lived there. Fred West was born into a rural environment far removed from the tight rows of Gloucester. His early life unfolded in the countryside, where isolation took on a different meaning. Fields instead of streets. Distance instead of density. But isolation, whether in open land or behind brick walls, has a way of influencing how a person understands boundaries, what is acceptable, what is not, what can be hidden and what cannot. Accounts of his childhood often point to instability, to behaviors and experiences that blurred the lines between normal development and something more troubling. But even then, nothing about his early years marked him, definitively, as someone who would one day become the center of such a case. That is part of what makes stories like this so difficult to process. There is no single moment where a clear path reveals itself. Only a series of smaller moments, each one easy to overlook on its own. By the time he reached adulthood, Fred had learned how to function within society in a way that drew little attention. He worked various jobs, interacted with others in ways that seemed ordinary enough, and moved through life without raising significant alarm. He was not invisible, but he was forgettable. And in many ways, that forgettability became a kind of shield. When Rose West entered his life, the dynamic shifted. She came from her own background of hardship, shaped by a childhood that, like Fred's, contained elements of instability and trauma. Where Fred could appear outwardly easygoing, Rose carried a sharper edge. There were moments when that edge surfaced, flashes of anger, of control, but like so many things in this story, those moments were often absorbed into the broader narrative of a difficult but not entirely unusual life. Together, they formed a partnership that would become central to everything that followed. Their relationship did not stand out in any obvious way at first. They married, had children, and settled into a version of domestic life that, from the outside, seemed consistent with the norms of the community around them. There were arguments, of course. There were tensions. But what family didn't have those? What household was completely free of conflict? This is how normalization works. It takes behaviors that might seem alarming in isolation and places them within a context that makes them easier to accept, easier to ignore. Over time, the unusual becomes familiar. The familiar becomes invisible. Inside number 25, that process unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Children grew up within those walls, their understanding of normal shaped entirely by what they experienced there. For them, the house was not unusual. It was simply home. The routines, the rules, the atmosphere, these were the constants of their lives. And when something feels constant, it becomes difficult to question. Outside the house, the neighborhood continued its steady rhythm. People went to work, returned home, watched television, shared conversations over fences or in passing on the street. The West family existed within that rhythm without disrupting it in any obvious way. They were part of the landscape, not separate from it. But there were moments, small, fleeting, that hinted at something else. A child who seemed withdrawn. A comment that didn't quite make sense. a visitor who appeared briefly and was never seen again. Each of these moments, on its own, was easy to dismiss. Life is full of incomplete information, of interactions that don't fully resolve. People come and go. Children have moods. Not everything requires explanation. And so the fragments remain just that, fragments. What makes this stage of the story so important is not what is visible, but what is not. The absence of intervention. The absence of sustained scrutiny. The absence of a reason, strong enough and clear enough, to force a deeper look. Because without that reason, life continues. Inside the house, the dynamic between Fred and Rose became more entrenched. Control, in its many forms, began to define the environment. Control over space, over movement, over the people within those walls. It did not announce itself loudly. It did not need to. It operated in the background, shaping behaviors, setting limits, creating a structure that was both rigid and, to outsiders, largely invisible. And within that structure, something darker took root. It is tempting, when looking back, to search for clear warning signs, moments where everything could have changed if only someone had acted differently. But reality is rarely that straightforward. Warning signs are often ambiguous. They require interpretation. And interpretation is influenced by context, by expectations, by the simple human tendency to assume that things are, more or less, as they appear. On Cromwell Street, appearance was everything. The house looked normal. The family looked functional. The neighborhood looked stable. There was no dramatic disruption, no singular event that forced the community to confront what might be happening behind closed doors. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of anomalies, each one too small to demand attention on its own. This is how environments like this persist. Not through complete invisibility, but through partial visibility. Through glimpses that never quite align into a full picture. Through a series of moments that, when viewed individually, seem explainable, even if, taken together, they tell a very different story. As the years passed, the gap between appearance and reality widened. What was happening inside number 25 became more severe, more entrenched, more difficult to reconcile with the life presented to the outside world. And yet, the presentation remained largely intact. This duality, the coexistence of normalcy and horror, is at the heart of this case. It challenges the assumptions people rely on to navigate the world. The belief that danger is visible. That it announces itself in ways that can be recognized and avoided. That homes are, by default, places of safety. Number 25, Cromwell Street undermined all of that. Because it showed that the most disturbing realities can exist within the most ordinary settings. That the line between safe and unsafe is not always where we expect it to be. And that sometimes, the things we choose not to question are the very things that matter most. By the time the truth began to surface, the foundations of that illusion had already been in place for decades. Built slowly, reinforced by routine, protected by silence. And as we move forward in this story, that foundation will begin to crack. Not all at once. But enough to let something through. Before the names were written into case files, before they became part of a narrative defined by violence, they were simply lives in motion, unfinished stories moving through ordinary days. To speak about them now requires care, because what was taken from them is not only their lives, but also the fullness of who they were before everything changed. And in a case like this, where the scale of the crimes threatens to overshadow individuality, it becomes even more important to slow down and look closely at the people behind the headlines. Some of them were daughters who left home with quiet determination, carrying small bags filled with more hope than certainty. Others were already navigating lives shaped by instability, searching for something steadier, something safer. They came from different places, different circumstances, but there was a shared thread that connected many of them, a vulnerability that made them easier to overlook, easier to dismiss when they disappeared. Take Heather West, for example. Inside the walls of number 25, Cromwell Street, she was not just a name. She was a child growing into adolescence, forming her understanding of the world based on the environment around her. For someone like Heather, home was not a place she visited, it was the entire framework through which she interpreted life. The rules, the moods, the tensions, the silences, these were constants. They shaped how she spoke, how she reacted, how she learned to navigate each day. There are fragments of memory from those who knew her, small glimpses that resist being erased. A laugh at the wrong moment. A hesitation before answering a question. The kind of subtle behaviors that, at the time, might not have seemed significant but, in hindsight, carry a different weight. Because they suggest awareness. Not necessarily a full understanding of what was happening, but a sense that something was not right. For Heather, the boundary between safety and danger was blurred from the very beginning. And that blurring makes her story particularly difficult to confront because it forces a question that has no easy answer. How does a child recognize harm when it is embedded in the very structure of their daily life? Beyond the house, the other victims moved through a different kind of uncertainty. Some were young women trying to find independence, navigating cities and streets that offered both opportunity and risk. In places like Gloucester, it was not uncommon to see people passing through, travelers, runaways, individuals between homes or jobs. Their presence did not stand out. They were part of the background, visible but not closely observed. And that visibility without scrutiny created a dangerous space. A young woman might arrive in the city with little more than a plan to get through the next few days. She might look for temporary work or simply a place to stay. She might trust the wrong person, not because she was careless, but because trust, in that moment, felt necessary. Survival often requires it. Imagine her walking along a dimly lit street, the air carrying that faint chill that settles in after sunset. She passes storefronts closing for the night, their lights flickering off one by one. There is a sense of transition in the atmosphere, the shift from activity to stillness. And in that stillness, decisions feel heavier. Where to go? Who to ask? Whether to accept an offer that seems, on the surface, generous. For many of the victims, these were the kinds of moments that defined their final hours of freedom. They were not reckless. They were navigating limited options. Some had families who searched for them, who reported them missing, who held on to the belief that they would return. Others did not have that same network of support, their disappearances blending into a larger pattern of absence that, at the time, did not immediately trigger alarm. In both cases, there was a gap, a period of time where questions existed without answers, where concern existed without direction. And in that gap, the trail grew colder. What makes these stories particularly painful is the contrast between what was visible and what was hidden. On one side, there are the ordinary details of their lives, favorite songs, small habits, conversations that seemed insignificant at the time. On the other, there is the abruptness with which those details end, replaced by uncertainty, by silence. Each victim carried a version of the future that was uniquely theirs. Plans that may not have been fully formed, but existed nonetheless. A job they hoped to find. A place they wanted to go. A relationship they were trying to repair or escape. These are the elements that rarely make it into official records, but they are the ones that matter most when trying to understand who these individuals were beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Inside number 25, the dynamic was different, but the loss was no less profound. Heather's story, in particular, forces a confrontation with the idea of trust within a family. The expectation that those closest to us are also those who protect us. When that expectation is broken, the impact extends beyond the immediate harm. It reshapes the very concept of safety, turning something foundational into something uncertain. There are moments, in cases like this, where the narrative threatens to become dominated by the perpetrators, their actions, their psychology, their ability to evade detection. But focusing too heavily on that aspect risks losing sight of the people who suffered the consequences. And in doing so, it unintentionally shifts the center of the story away from where it belongs. Because this is not just a story about what was done. It is a story about who it was done to. About lives interrupted, not in abstract terms, but in specific, tangible ways. A birthday that was never celebrated. A conversation that was never finished. a path that was never completed. When investigators later worked to identify the remains found at Cromwell Street, they were not just assembling evidence. They were, in a sense, reconstructing identities. Trying to connect fragments of bone to names, to histories, to families who had been waiting, sometimes for years, for any kind of answer. And those answers, when they came, were not the kind anyone hopes for. But they were answers nonetheless. They replaced uncertainty with a different kind of weight, the weight of knowing. For the families, that knowledge marked the end of one kind of suffering and the beginning of another. Because closure, in cases like this, is never complete. It does not erase what happened. It does not restore what was lost. It simply provides a boundary where there was once only open-ended absence. As we move through this part of the story, it is important to hold on to that distinction. To remember that behind every detail, every discovery, every revelation, there are individuals whose lives extended far beyond the moment they encountered the people responsible for their deaths. They existed before. They mattered before. And they deserve to be remembered as more than victims. Because in the end, what was taken from them cannot be fully measured by what was done. It can only be understood, in part, by recognizing what might have been the lives they were in the process of building, the identities they were still shaping, the futures that were never given the chance to unfold. And that understanding, however incomplete, is what gives this story its weight. Not just the horror of what happened, but the humanity of those who were lost within it. There is a moment, in every crime, where possibility collapses into inevitability. A point where a path that could have turned in any direction narrows into something inescapable. In this story, those moments did not happen once. They happened again and again, repeating over the course of years, each time beginning with something deceptively small, a conversation, an invitation, a door opening just wide enough to feel safe. Inside number 25, Cromwell Street, the air often carried a stillness that felt heavier than silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. The house itself seemed to absorb it, holding onto it within the walls, beneath the floorboards, in the narrow spaces between rooms where light struggled to reach. To step inside was to enter a controlled environment, one where movement, tone, even the rhythm of breathing could shift depending on who was watching. Fred West understood how to create that environment. He did not rely on sudden violence, not at first. He relied on gradual shifts, on making the unfamiliar feel tolerable, then normal, then unavoidable. A conversation that lingered too long. A joke that crossed a boundary and was then dismissed. A touch that seemed accidental, followed by reassurance. Each action, on its own, small enough to question, but not enough to provoke immediate resistance. And then there was Rose West, whose presence added another layer to the dynamic. Where Fred might disarm, Rose could enforce. Her authority within the house was not always visible, but it was deeply felt. There were moments when her voice would cut through the space with a sharpness that left no room for misunderstanding. Other times, it was her silence that carried weight, a look, a pause, a subtle shift in expression that signaled something was about to change. Together, they created a system that did not rely on chaos. It relied on control. For the victims who entered that house from the outside world, the transition was often gradual. A place to stay for the night might turn into a longer visit. A sense of unease might be pushed aside by the immediate need for shelter or companionship. The boundaries between guest and captive did not always reveal themselves instantly. They tightened slowly, almost imperceptibly, until leaving became complicated, then difficult, then impossible. Time inside the house did not move the same way it did outside. Hours blurred. Days lost their structure. Without clear reference points, it became harder to measure how long someone had been there, how long they had been subjected to the shifting rules of the environment. And in that disorientation, resistance weakened. The incidents themselves were not singular events. They were patterns. A routine would form. It might begin with isolation, separating the victim from any sense of external connection. Then came the testing of boundaries, the gradual escalation of behavior designed to gauge reaction, to identify limits, to push just beyond them. Each response informed the next step. Each hesitation, each attempt to comply, each moment of fear became part of a larger calculation. And then, at some point, the pretense would fall away. What followed was not impulsive. It was deliberate. Rooms that had once seemed ordinary took on a different function. A bedroom was no longer just a place to sleep. A hallway was no longer just a passage between spaces. Every part of the house could be reproposed, redefined according to the needs of those in control. The environment itself became an extension of their intent, shaping what could happen and how it could unfold. For the victims, the experience was one of increasing confinement, not just physically, but psychologically. The sense of being watched, of being evaluated, of existing within a system where the rules were constantly shifting but always enforced. There was no stable ground to stand on, no clear way to predict what would happen next. And in that uncertainty, fear took root. But fear, in this context, was not always loud. It did not always manifest as panic or resistance. Sometimes, it appeared as compliance, as stillness, as an attempt to navigate the situation in the least dangerous way possible. Survival, in those moments, became a series of calculations: what to say, what not to say, when to move, when to remain still. Inside number 25, those calculations rarely led to escape. The violence, when it came, was not random. It followed a trajectory that had been building over time. The earlier stages, the conversations, the boundary testing, the control, were all part of that trajectory. By the time the final act occurred, the victim had already been drawn into a system designed to strip away autonomy, to reduce options, to make resistance increasingly difficult. And then, abruptly, everything would end. The transition from presence to absence was immediate, but its impact extended far beyond that moment. Outside the house, people would begin to notice, slowly at first. A missed appointment. A call that was never returned. A person who simply did not reappear where they were expected. Each disappearance created a ripple, but those ripples did not always converge. They remained separate, unconnected, each one lacking the context needed to reveal the larger pattern. Inside the house, the aftermath followed its own process. What had been a person became something that needed to be concealed. The shift was stark, almost mechanical. Emotion, if it existed, was not visible in any conventional sense. The focus moved to practicality, how to ensure that what had happened remained hidden, how to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. The house, once again, adapted. Spaces were altered. Floors were lifted. Soil was disturbed and then carefully replaced. The environment absorbed the evidence, layer by layer, until it became part of the structure itself. To walk through those rooms, to stand in that garden, was to stand above something that was no longer visible but very much present. And then life would resume. Meals would be prepared. Conversations would take place. Children would move through the house, their routines continuing as if nothing had shifted. The contrast between what had just occurred and what followed is one of the most unsettling aspects of this case. It speaks to a level of compartmentalization that is difficult to fully comprehend, a separation between action and appearance so complete that it allowed the cycle to continue. Because it did continue. Not once, but multiple times. Each incident reinforcing the system. Each act of concealment making the next one easier. The house became both the setting and the instrument, a place where the boundaries between living space and burial ground dissolved entirely. For those outside, the pattern remained obscured. Disappearances were noted, but not immediately connected. The victims came from different backgrounds, different circumstances. There was no obvious thread linking them, no single point of reference that could bring the pieces together. And so the incidents remained isolated in perception, even as they formed a continuous sequence in reality. It is only in hindsight that the pattern becomes clear. Only when the individual stories are placed side by side that the repetition reveals itself, the similarities in circumstance, the proximity in location, the underlying structure that connects them all. But during the years when it was happening, that clarity did not exist. Instead, there was only the house. Standing quietly on Cromwell Street, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in its role within the neighborhood. A place where doors opened and closed, where lights turned on and off, where life, on the surface, continued as it always had. And inside, the cycle repeated. Until, eventually, something shifted. Not within the house itself, but beyond it. A question asked at the wrong time. A detail that did not align. A voice that refused to remain silent. The incidents, for so long contained within those walls, were about to intersect with the outside world in a way they never had before. And when that intersection came, it would begin to unravel everything. By the time suspicion began to gather around number 25, Cromwell Street, it did not arrive as a single, undeniable revelation. It came the way truth often does in cases like this, fragmented, uncertain, carried on the voices of those who had lived closest to it. The house had held its silence for years, but silence, when pressed from enough directions, begins to fracture. It started with discomfort that could no longer be explained away. Inside the family, there were memories that did not align, absences that could not be accounted for with simple answers. Questions that had once been met with vague explanations began to return, sharper each time, less willing to be dismissed. Among the children who had grown up within those walls, there were those who began to look back and realize that what they had experienced was not just unusual, it was wrong. And when one voice finally broke through, it carried enough weight to reach beyond the house. Authorities were first drawn in not by the scale of what had happened, but by a specific concern, a report that something inside the home was deeply, fundamentally out of place. At that stage, no one yet understood the full extent of what they were stepping into. There was no clear map, no complete narrative. Only a series of allegations, some difficult to verify, others too serious to ignore. When officers first approached number 25, it looked exactly as it always had. The same narrow frontage. The same windows, slightly obscured by curtains. The same door, standing between the outside world and whatever lay within. There was nothing about the exterior that suggested the complexity or the horror hidden beneath it. Inside, however, the atmosphere shifted. Even before any physical evidence was uncovered, there was a sense that the space carried something unresolved. Rooms felt smaller than they should have, not just in size, but in the way they seemed to hold onto the past. Objects were arranged in ways that hinted at control rather than comfort. The air itself felt heavy, as though it had been still for too long. Interviews began. Questions were asked. And as those questions grew more specific, the responses began to fracture. Timelines didn't align. Explanations overlapped or contradicted each other. There were names that surfaced briefly and then disappeared again, references to people who had once been present but were no longer accounted for. One name, in particular, began to draw attention. Heather. Heather West had not been seen for years, and the explanations surrounding her absence were vague at best. There were suggestions that she had left, that she had chosen to go elsewhere, to start a different life. But there was no clear evidence to support that narrative. No confirmed sightings. No consistent communication. Just a gap, stretching over time, filled with uncertainty. As investigators pressed further, that gap began to feel less like a coincidence and more like a starting point. The decision to search the property did not come lightly. It required a shift from suspicion to action, from questioning to physical intrusion. When that decision was made, it marked the beginning of a process that would fundamentally alter the understanding of everything connected to that house. The first stages of the search were cautious, methodical. Officers moved through the interior, documenting what they saw, noting details that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Floors were examined. Walls were measured. The structure of the house itself became a subject of scrutiny, each element considered not just for what it was, but for what it might conceal. And then, attention turned to the ground. The garden at the back of the house was small, enclosed, unremarkable at first glance. It was the kind of space that might hold a few plants, perhaps a place to sit in warmer months. But as investigators began to examine it more closely, subtle irregularities emerged. The soil did not appear entirely consistent. There were areas where the texture seemed different, where the ground had been disturbed and then resettled. It was not proof, but it was enough to continue. The first excavation began with a careful removal of the top layer of soil. Each movement was deliberate, each section documented. There is a particular tension that accompanies this kind of work, the knowledge that something may be found, combined with the uncertainty of what that something will be. Minutes stretched into hours. And then, eventually, the ground gave way to something that did not belong. At first, it was only a fragment. A shape that contrasted with the surrounding earth, pale against the darker soil. For a moment, there is often hesitation, a pause where the mind attempts to interpret what the eyes are seeing. But trained investigators recognize these signs quickly. Human remains. The discovery shifted everything. What had been an investigation into a possible missing person case became something far more expansive, far more serious. The presence of one body suggested the possibility of others. The garden, once an afterthought, became a focal point. The house itself, already under scrutiny, took on an entirely new significance. Excavation intensified. Sections of the garden were carefully divided, each area examined with increasing precision. As the work continued, more remains were uncovered. Each discovery reinforcing the same conclusion: this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, repeated over time, hidden beneath layers of soil and silence. Inside the house, attention turned to the structure itself. Floorboards were lifted. Spaces beneath the rooms, areas that had gone undisturbed for years, were opened. The air that emerged from those spaces carried a different weight, a different kind of stillness. And within those confined areas, more evidence began to surface. The house was no longer just a place where events had occurred. It had become part of the concealment, part of the process that allowed those events to remain hidden. The scale of the discovery was difficult to process, even for those directly involved in the investigation. Each new finding expanded the scope, adding layers to a narrative that was growing more complex with every passing day. What had once seemed like a series of disconnected concerns was now revealing itself as something coordinated, sustained, and deeply embedded within the property. Outside, the atmosphere began to change. Word spread quickly, first through local channels, then beyond. The quiet anonymity of Cromwell Street was replaced by attention, intense, focused, and unrelenting. People who had once passed by number 25 without a second glance now looked at it differently, trying to reconcile the familiar exterior with what was being uncovered beneath it. Media presence grew. Cameras appeared. Reporters gathered, their voices carrying information that was still incomplete, still evolving. The narrative was forming in real time, each new detail reshaping the public's understanding of what had happened. But for the investigators, the focus remained on the ground, on the structure, on the evidence that continued to emerge piece by piece. Each set of remains required careful handling, careful documentation. Identification would come later, through a process that was both scientific and deeply human. For now, the priority was recovery, ensuring that every fragment was accounted for, that nothing was overlooked. Inside the house, the sense of space changed as more areas were opened. Rooms that had once seemed fixed began to feel unstable, their boundaries shifting as hidden compartments were revealed. The house was, in a very real sense, being dismantled, not physically, not yet, but structurally, in the way it was understood. It was no longer just a home. It was a site. A location defined by what had been done there, by what had been hidden, by what was now being brought into the open. And as the days passed, one realization became impossible to ignore. This had been happening for years. Not in secret from everyone, but in a way that avoided full recognition. In fragments, in glimpses, in moments that never quite aligned until now. The discovery process was not just uncovering physical evidence. It was reconstructing time, connecting events that had once seemed unrelated into a single, continuous sequence. The house had kept its secrets well. But not perfectly. Because in the end, it was not the structure itself that revealed the truth. It was the people within it, the voices that finally broke the silence, the questions that refused to fade. The ground only confirmed what had already begun to surface. And now, with that confirmation, there was no turning back. What lay beneath number 25, Cromwell Street, was no longer hidden. It was evidence. And it was only the beginning of understanding what had truly happened there. Once the ground at number 25, Cromwell Street, began to give up its secrets, the investigation entered a phase that was both urgent and uncertain. The discoveries had confirmed that something systematic had taken place, something that extended beyond a single act or a single victim. But confirmation is not the same as clarity. Knowing that multiple lives had ended within that space did not immediately reveal how, or why, or in what sequence those events had unfolded. The house had become a source of answers, but also a source of new and more complicated questions. In the early days following the initial excavations, the focus widened rapidly. What had first centered on one missing person, Heather West, now expanded into an investigation that spanned decades. Each set of remains recovered from the property represented not just a life lost, but a timeline that needed to be reconstructed. When had this person last been seen? Who had they been in contact with? How had they come to be connected, however briefly, to this house in Gloucester? These questions did not always have immediate answers. Investigators began the painstaking process of cross-referencing missing persons reports, some recent, others dating back many years. Files that had once been closed or set aside were reopened. Names that had faded from public attention resurfaced, now linked by a common thread that had not been visible before. The challenge was immense. Records from earlier decades were not always complete. Communication between jurisdictions had not always been consistent. In many cases, the individuals who had gone missing were not part of systems that ensured sustained follow-up. This created gaps. And those gaps became the space where uncertainty lived. At the center of the investigation stood Fred West and Rose West, but even their roles were not immediately defined in full. There was an assumption, based on proximity and circumstance, that they were responsible for what had been found. But assumption is not enough in a case of this magnitude. Every detail needed to be established, supported, connected. Interviews became a critical part of that process. Family members were questioned, some of them now adults, asked to revisit memories that had long been buried or suppressed. These were not straightforward conversations. Memory, especially when shaped by fear or confusion, does not present itself in clean, linear narratives. It comes in fragments, images, sensations, isolated moments that resist easy interpretation. Investigators had to navigate these fragments carefully, piecing them together without imposing conclusions too quickly. There were inconsistencies. There were contradictions. But within those inconsistencies, patterns began to emerge. Accounts of behavior inside the house pointed to a controlled environment, one where movement and interaction were closely monitored. There were references to visitors who stayed briefly, to individuals who appeared and then vanished without explanation. At the time, these occurrences had not seemed significant enough to report. In hindsight, they took on a different meaning. Outside the family, the investigation reached into the broader community. People who had once crossed paths with the occupants of number 25 were asked to recall those interactions. Neighbors, acquaintances, former colleagues, each perspective offered a slightly different view, a piece of the larger puzzle. Some remembered nothing unusual. Others recalled moments that, at the time, had seemed odd but not alarming. A raised voice. A tense exchange. A feeling that something was not quite right, though they could not say exactly what. These recollections, while valuable, were not definitive. They pointed toward a pattern, but they did not establish it conclusively. At the same time, investigators had to consider alternative possibilities. In any case involving multiple victims, especially over an extended period, there is always the question of whether a single explanation can account for everything. Could all the remains found at the property be linked to the same individuals? Was it possible that others had been involved? Were there victims who had no connection to the house at all, whose cases were being drawn into the investigation based on incomplete information? These questions created investigative branches that extended in different directions. Some led to dead ends. Others circled back to the same central point. One of the most challenging aspects of this phase was the absence of direct evidence for certain periods of time. While the physical discoveries at the house were undeniable, connecting those discoveries to specific events required more than proximity. It required timelines, corroboration, and, in many cases, forensic analysis that could take weeks or months to complete. During this time, Fred West was in custody, and his role became increasingly significant. He was not just a suspect, he was potentially the only person who could provide a coherent account of what had happened over the years. But relying on such a source comes with its own risks. Statements can be incomplete, self-serving, or deliberately misleading. Each claim needed to be tested against the evidence, confirmed where possible, challenged where necessary. There were moments when his accounts appeared to align with what investigators had found. Details about locations within the house, about methods of concealment, about the sequence of certain events. But there were also gaps, places where information was withheld or altered, where the narrative shifted in ways that made it difficult to establish a consistent version of the truth. And then there was Rose West, whose position within the investigation was more complex. While the evidence placed her within the environment where these crimes had occurred, determining the extent of her involvement required careful examination. Was she a participant? A witness? A figure who exercised control in ways that were not immediately visible in the physical evidence? Her responses during questioning did not provide straightforward answers. There were denials. There were deflections. There were moments where the absence of explanation spoke as loudly as any statement. This created a dynamic within the investigation where certainty and uncertainty existed side by side. On one hand, the physical evidence was accumulating, each discovery reinforcing the reality of what had taken place. On the other, the human elements, the motivations, the roles, the sequence of actions, remained partially obscured. As the investigation continued, public attention intensified. The case had already captured widespread interest, but the evolving nature of the discoveries kept it at the forefront of national awareness. Each new development was reported, analyzed, discussed. The pressure on investigators grew, not just to find answers, but to find them quickly. But speed, in this context, was not always possible. Accuracy mattered more. Rushing to conclusions risked overlooking critical details, misinterpreting evidence, or failing to establish the connections needed to support legal proceedings. The investigation had to move forward carefully, even as the demand for clarity increased. There were moments of frustration. Leads that seemed promising would fail to produce results. Witnesses who might have provided insight were unable to recall specific details. Records that could have clarified timelines were incomplete or missing. Each obstacle slowed the process, extending the period of uncertainty. And yet, despite these challenges, the overall direction of the investigation remained focused. Everything pointed back to number 25. To the house. To the people who had lived within it. The question was no longer whether they were connected to the crimes. That connection had been established through the discoveries. The question now was how deeply that connection extended, how it could be defined, and how it could be proven in a way that would hold under scrutiny. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to move closer to a turning point. Not because all the answers had been found, but because enough pieces had come together to form a clearer picture. Patterns that had once been speculative were now supported by evidence. Connections that had once seemed coincidental were now understood as part of a larger structure. The gaps had not disappeared, but they had narrowed. And within that narrowing, a path forward began to take shape. A path that would lead from uncertainty toward confrontation, from questions toward answers that could no longer be avoided. There is a moment in long investigations when the weight of scattered details begins to compress into something more solid, more undeniable. It does not arrive with a single dramatic revelation, but rather through accumulation, the quiet alignment of evidence, testimony, and time. In the case of number 25, Cromwell Street, that moment did not feel like clarity at first. It felt like pressure. By then, the investigation had already unearthed what could not be ignored. The ground had given up its secrets. The house had been opened in ways it never had before. Fragments of lives had been recovered and carefully catalogued, each one carrying a story that needed to be told. But the narrative itself, the structure that connected those fragments, was still incomplete. Investigators needed more than physical evidence. They needed coherence. And that coherence began to emerge from a source that was as essential as it was unreliable, the words of Fred West. At first, his interactions with authorities had been cautious, uneven. There were admissions, but they were partial. There were descriptions, but they lacked full context. It was as if he were revealing pieces of a puzzle without ever allowing the full image to be seen. Each statement had to be tested, compared against what had already been discovered. Some details aligned with the evidence in ways that could not be coincidental. Others seemed to distort or omit key elements, creating gaps that investigators had to work to fill. But over time, something shifted. Whether it was the mounting weight of the evidence, the realization that the scope of what had been uncovered could no longer be contained, or a more personal calculation, his account began to expand. Not in a smooth or consistent way, but in bursts of moments where information surfaced that connected directly to the physical findings at the house. He spoke of locations within the property. Specific areas. Spaces that had already drawn the attention of investigators during the excavation process. When his descriptions matched what had been uncovered, when details about placement, about concealment, about the sequence of actions aligned with the forensic evidence, it created a convergence that was difficult to dispute. For the investigative team, these moments were critical. They provided a form of validation, a confirmation that the path they were following was leading toward something accurate, something grounded in reality rather than speculation. Each point of alignment reduced uncertainty, tightened the narrative, brought the case closer to something that could be presented clearly and convincingly. But with each confirmation came a deeper understanding of the scale. It was no longer a question of isolated incidents. It was a sustained pattern. Years of actions, repeated within the same environment, following a structure that had become more defined with each new piece of information. The house was not just a location where crimes had occurred. It was the center of a system that had been built, maintained, and protected over time. And as that system became clearer, so did the roles within it. The focus began to shift more directly toward Rose West. Up to this point, her position in the narrative had been more ambiguous. She was present, unquestionably. She had lived within the house, shared the space where everything had taken place. But presence alone is not the same as participation, and the investigation required more than assumption. The turning point came not from a single statement, but from a convergence of sources. Testimony from those who had lived in the house. Observations about behavior, about control, about the dynamics that defined daily life within those walls. These accounts began to form a pattern that extended beyond passive awareness. They suggested involvement, active, intentional, embedded within the same system that had been attributed to Fred. Details emerged that were difficult to reconcile with the idea of distance or ignorance. Accounts of authority. Moments where her actions influenced what happened to others within the house. Instances where the line between observer and participant blurred, then disappeared entirely. These were not isolated recollections. They echoed across different testimonies, reinforcing each other in ways that strengthened their credibility. At the same time, investigators continued to analyze the physical evidence recovered from the property. Forensic work advanced, providing more precise information about the remains, about timelines, about the conditions under which the victims had been concealed. Each report added another layer to the case, another point of reference that could be compared against the accounts being provided. And again, there were moments of alignment. Moments where the physical and the verbal intersected in ways that clarified what had once been uncertain. This intersection became the foundation of the breakthrough. It was not a single discovery, but a synthesis. The combination of recovered evidence, corroborated statements, and reconstructed timelines created a narrative that was both detailed and consistent. It did not answer every question, cases like this rarely do, but it provided enough clarity to move forward with confidence. For the investigators, this was the point where the case shifted from exploration to preparation. The focus moved toward building something that could withstand scrutiny beyond the investigation itself. Something that could be presented in a courtroom, examined, challenged, and ultimately upheld. Every detail had to be precise. Every connection had to be supported. The margin for error narrowed significantly. Meanwhile, Fred West remained a central figure in this process, but his role was becoming more defined in a different way. His admissions, while valuable, were no longer the sole driver of the narrative. The case had grown beyond him. The evidence now existed independently, capable of standing on its own. And that shift carried implications. Because it meant that the truth of what had happened at number 25 was no longer dependent on what he chose to reveal. It had been uncovered, documented, preserved. As this realization took hold, the investigation reached a level of clarity that had seemed distant in its early stages. The fragments had come together. The gaps, while still present, had been reduced to a point where they no longer obscured the overall picture. What had once been a collection of uncertainties was now a structured account. A sequence of events. A pattern of behavior. A system of actions that could be traced, examined, and understood. And within that structure, the roles of both Fred West and Rose West were no longer ambiguous. They were defined. But with that definition came a new kind of tension. Because the investigation, for all its progress, was not the final stage. What had been uncovered now needed to be confronted in a different arena. One where evidence would be tested, where narratives would be challenged, where the conclusions drawn by investigators would be subjected to scrutiny from every angle. The breakthrough had provided clarity. But clarity, in this context, was only the beginning of the next phase. A phase where the truth, assembled piece by piece, would be placed in front of the world and asked to stand on its own. And where the question would no longer be what happened, but how it would be judged. By the time the case moved into the courtroom, the weight of what had been uncovered at number 25, Cromwell Street, was already pressing heavily on the public consciousness. The investigation had transformed a quiet address in Gloucester into a symbol of something far darker, something that challenged the very idea of what could remain hidden within an ordinary life. But a courtroom is not a place for symbols. It is a place for structure, for evidence, for narratives that must be built carefully and tested relentlessly. And in this case, there was an absence that shaped everything from the very beginning. Fred West was no longer there to stand trial. In the months leading up to what would have been his court appearance, while held in custody, he had taken his own life. The act closed off one path to resolution even as it opened another. It meant that many of the questions surrounding his direct actions would never be addressed in a courtroom setting. There would be no cross-examination, no public confrontation between accusation and response. Whatever he might have said, whatever clarity or confusion his testimony could have added, was now permanently out of reach. What remained was the case against Rose West. Her trial, which began in 1995, carried a different kind of tension. Without Fred present, the focus narrowed. The courtroom became the space where her role would be examined in detail, where the distinction between presence and participation would be defined not by speculation, but by evidence and testimony. From the outset, the atmosphere was charged. Not in a dramatic, theatrical sense, but in a quieter, more sustained way. Every person in the room understood the gravity of what was being presented. The charges were severe. The number of victims, the duration of the crimes, the nature of what had been uncovered, all of it contributed to a sense that this was not just another case, but something that would leave a lasting mark. The prosecution began to lay out its narrative. It did not rely on a single thread, because no single thread could carry the full weight of what had been discovered. Instead, it built a structure piece by piece. Forensic evidence from the house. Testimony from those who had lived within its walls. Statements that had been gathered during the investigation. Each element was introduced carefully, connected deliberately to the next, forming a chain that aimed to demonstrate not just knowledge, but involvement. The remains recovered from number 25 were central to this process. Each identification brought with it a story that had been interrupted, a life that had been reduced to fragments and then reconstructed through scientific analysis. The courtroom became a place where those fragments were given context, where the victims were acknowledged not just as evidence, but as individuals whose absence demanded explanation. Experts took the stand. They spoke about the condition of the remains, about the methods used to identify them, about the conclusions that could be drawn from their analysis. Their language was precise, technical, grounded in data. But beneath that precision lay something else, a recognition of the human reality behind the science. Witnesses followed. Some of them had been part of the household. Others had interacted with the family in different capacities. Their accounts varied in detail and perspective, but together they painted a picture of life inside number 25 that was difficult to dismiss. They spoke of control, of fear, of an environment where the boundaries between authority and harm were blurred in ways that were both subtle and overt. There were moments when the courtroom fell into a kind of stillness as these accounts were delivered. Not silence in the literal sense, but a pause in the collective movement of attention, as if the weight of what was being said required time to settle. Throughout this, Rose West maintained her position. She denied the charges. Consistently. Firmly. Her responses did not shift in a way that aligned with the narrative being presented by the prosecution. Where they described involvement, she asserted distance. Where they outlined patterns, she rejected the interpretation. This created a clear divide within the courtroom, a tension between two fundamentally different versions of reality. The defense sought to reinforce that divide. They questioned the reliability of testimony, particularly from those whose memories were shaped by trauma and time. They examined the gaps in the evidence, the places where certainty gave way to interpretation. They raised the possibility that presence within the house did not necessarily equate to participation in what had occurred there. It was a strategy grounded in doubt. Not necessarily to provide an alternative explanation for every element of the case, but to challenge the idea that the prosecution's narrative was the only one possible. In doing so, they aimed to create enough uncertainty to prevent a definitive conclusion. But the prosecution's case did not rest on a single point of vulnerability. It rested on accumulation. On the way different forms of evidence reinforced each other. On the consistency that emerged when individual accounts were placed side by side. On the alignment between what had been said and what had been found. This convergence became the central strength of their argument. Day by day, the trial continued. Each session adding another layer, another perspective, another piece of the overall structure. For those present, the experience was not one of sudden revelation, but of gradual understanding. The picture became clearer not through a single moment, but through repetition, through reinforcement, through the steady presentation of interconnected details. Outside the courtroom, public attention remained intense. The case had already captured widespread interest, but the trial brought it into sharper focus. Reports summarized each day's proceedings, translating the complexity of the legal process into narratives that could be followed by those not present. The story, already powerful, became more immediate, more tangible. But inside the courtroom, the process remained methodical. When the time came for closing arguments, both sides returned to the central question. Not what had happened at number 25, that had been established through the evidence, but what role Rose West had played in those events. The prosecution framed their argument around involvement, around the idea that the environment within the house could not have functioned in the way it did without her active participation. They pointed to the patterns, to the consistency across different accounts, to the alignment between testimony and physical evidence. The defense returned to doubt. To the absence of direct evidence in certain instances. To the possibility of alternative interpretations. To the idea that the prosecution had constructed a narrative that, while compelling, was not the only one that could explain the facts. And then, after weeks of testimony, of analysis, of argument, the case was placed in the hands of the jury. Their task was not to absorb the emotional weight of the story, but to evaluate the evidence presented to determine whether it met the standard required for conviction. It was a process that demanded focus, deliberation, and a careful balancing of all that had been seen and heard. When the verdict came, it did so with a clarity that reflected that process. Guilty. On multiple counts. The decision did not arrive with dramatic flourish. It did not need to. The words themselves carried enough weight. They represented the culmination of everything that had been uncovered, everything that had been argued, everything that had been examined within that courtroom. The sentence followed. Life imprisonment. A term that, in this context, carried the understanding that release would not be part of the future. It was the legal system's final statement on the matter, its way of defining accountability within the framework available to it. And with that, the trial came to an end. But endings, in cases like this, are never complete. Because while the courtroom can deliver a verdict, it cannot resolve everything that led to that point. It cannot restore what was lost. It cannot fully answer the deeper questions about how such a situation was allowed to exist for so long. What it can do is establish a record. A formal acknowledgement of what occurred. A structured narrative that can be examined, understood, and remembered. And in doing so, it marks a transition. From investigation to judgment. From uncertainty to a form of resolution that, while imperfect, is as close as the system can come. The house on Cromwell Street had already begun to lose its physical presence. Now, the story it contained had been given a different kind of form. One that would endure long after the courtroom emptied. When the trial ended and the verdict was delivered, there was no single moment where everything felt resolved. The courtroom emptied. The formal language of law gave way to quieter, more personal reactions. For some, there was a sense of closure, not complete, not absolute, but enough to mark the end of a long period of uncertainty. For others, the conclusion felt partial, defined as much by what remained unanswered as by what had been established. Because in cases like this, justice is not a clean line. It is a boundary. A point where the system says, this is what we can determine, this is what we can prove, this is how we respond. But beyond that boundary, there are questions that do not fit neatly into legal frameworks. Questions about how something like this could develop, how it could persist, how it could remain hidden for so long in a place as ordinary as a house on a quiet street in Gloucester. In the months that followed, number 25, Cromwell Street no longer functioned as a home, or even as an active crime scene. It became something else entirely, a symbol, a point of reference in conversations that extended far beyond the immediate details of the case. People who had never been to Gloucester knew the address. They knew what had been found there. And with that knowledge came a kind of unease that was difficult to articulate. Because the house did not look like what people expected. It did not match the image of danger that many rely on to feel secure. There were no obvious warning signs visible from the outside, nothing that would have clearly marked it as a place to avoid. It blended in. It existed within the same visual language as every other house on the street. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what made it so unsettling. The idea that something so extreme could exist within such an ordinary setting forces a reconsideration of assumptions. It challenges the belief that harm is always visible, that it announces itself in ways that can be recognized and avoided. It suggests that the line between safe and unsafe is not always where we expect it to be. For the families of the victims, the aftermath followed a different path. The trial had provided answers, but those answers came with a permanence that could not be softened. To know what had happened is to carry that knowledge forward, to integrate it into a life that must continue despite it. There is no simple way to do that. No clear progression from grief to acceptance. Instead, there is a process that unfolds over time, shaped by memory, by absence, by the effort to hold on to the parts of a person that existed before they became part of a case. Each victim had a life that extended beyond the moment they encountered the people responsible for their deaths. They had histories, relationships, plans that were still forming. The investigation and the trial brought their names back into focus, but those names carry more than the circumstances of their loss. They represent individuals whose identities cannot be reduced to what was done to them. Remembering that is part of the aftermath. It is a way of restoring balance to a story that, by its nature, risks becoming dominated by the actions of those who caused harm. It is a reminder that the center of this narrative is not the house, not the perpetrators, but the lives that were interrupted within it. At a broader level, the case prompted reflection within institutions as well. Procedures were examined. Systems were questioned. The way missing persons cases were handled, the way information was shared, the way patterns were identified, or missed, became subjects of discussion and, in some instances, change. These shifts did not emerge instantly, nor did they resolve every issue. But they represented an acknowledgement that something in the existing framework had allowed this situation to persist longer than it should have. There is a tendency, after cases like this, to look for a single point of failure. A moment where, if something had been done differently, everything might have changed. But the reality is often more complex. It is not one missed signal, but many. Not one oversight, but a series of small gaps that, over time, create enough space for something hidden to remain concealed. Understanding that complexity is uncomfortable. It resists simple conclusions. But it is necessary if the goal is not just to react, but to learn. In 1996, the physical structure of number 25, Cromwell Street was removed. The house was demolished, its materials cleared away, the space it had occupied left open. On one level, this was a practical decision, a way to prevent the location from becoming a site of morbid curiosity. On another, it carried symbolic weight, the idea that removing the structure might also remove some part of what had happened there. But places do not hold meaning on their own. Meaning comes from memory. From the stories attached to them. From the way those stories are told and retold over time. Even without the house, the events that took place there remain. They exist in records, in testimony, in the collective awareness shaped by the case. They are part of a larger conversation about safety, about trust, about the ways in which harm can be hidden within the familiar. And within that conversation, there are no easy answers. Only perspectives. Only questions that continue to surface, even years later. How do we recognize patterns that are not immediately visible? How do we respond to uncertainty without overreacting or dismissing what might matter? How do we balance the instinct to trust with the need to question? These are not questions with definitive solutions. They are ongoing considerations, shaped by context, by experience, by the information available at any given time. But they are part of what remains after the details of a case have settled. As for Rose West, she continues to exist within the confines of the sentence imposed by the court. Her denials have remained consistent, her position unchanged despite the outcome of the trial. That persistence adds another layer to the story, another point of tension between established judgment and personal narrative. And Fred West, absent from the trial that might have further defined his role, remains a figure whose actions are understood primarily through the evidence left behind and the fragments of information he provided before his death. His absence is part of the story now, a gap that cannot be filled, only acknowledged. In the end, what remains is not just a case, but a collection of lessons, some clear, others still unfolding. The importance of listening when something feels wrong, even if it cannot be immediately explained. The need to examine patterns, not just individual events. The recognition that normal appearances do not guarantee safe realities. And above all, the understanding that behind every investigation, every trial, every headline, there are people whose lives deserve to be remembered in full, not just in part. The street in Gloucester continues to exist, its rhythm restored in ways that are visible to anyone who passes through. Houses stand where they have always stood. People come and go. Life moves forward, as it always does. But beneath that movement, there is a layer of history that cannot be erased. Not by time. Not by demolition. Not by the closing of a courtroom door. It remains in the stories we tell, in the questions we continue to ask, and in the effort to understand not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen, and what that means for everything that comes after. There is a point, long after a case has ended in the eyes of the law, where the story stops belonging to investigators, to courts, or even to the headlines. It becomes something quieter and more persistent. It settles into memory, into public consciousness, into the uneasy spaces where people try to reconcile what they know about the world with what they have learned is possible within it. The case of number 25, Cromwell Street in Gloucester, is one of those stories. Even after the house was demolished, after the trial concluded, after the legal system delivered its verdicts, what remained did not fade in the way physical structures do. Instead, it shifted form. It became a reference point, something invoked whenever people speak about hidden crimes, about the dangers of assumption, about the gap between appearance and reality. At the center of that memory are the names that define the case, Fred West and Rose West. But over time, even those names begin to lose their sharpness in public discourse. What remains sharper, more enduring, is the place itself. The idea of the house. The concept of a normal-looking environment concealing something profoundly abnormal beneath its surface. That contrast is what continues to unsettle people. Because it removes the comfort of distance. It suggests that danger does not always exist in clearly marked spaces, that it can exist within structures that appear familiar, even ordinary. And once that idea takes root, it changes how people look at the world around them. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts of attention. A second glance at a closed door. A reconsideration of what is heard but not immediately explained. A lingering awareness that not everything visible reflects what is true. For those directly affected by the case, the families, the communities, the individuals who lived near or alongside the events, the passage of time does not erase the weight of what happened. It reshapes it. Memory does not remain static. It evolves, sometimes softening at the edges, sometimes becoming more defined in unexpected ways. But it does not disappear. The victims, whose lives intersected with the house in ways that were brief but irreversible, remain central to any reflection on the case. Their identities are not defined by the circumstances of their deaths alone, even though those circumstances dominate the public record. Each of them existed as a person before they became part of an investigation. They had histories, relationships, directions their lives were moving toward. Those elements do not vanish because they were interrupted. Remembering that is part of how the story continues to be told. In professional contexts, the case has been studied extensively. It has informed discussions in criminology, in policing, in forensic investigation. Not because it offers simple lessons, but because it does not. It presents complexity at every level, behavioral, structural, procedural. It forces examination of how patterns can be missed, how systems can fail to connect information that, in hindsight, appears clearly linked. One of the most significant reflections drawn from the case is not about the nature of the crimes themselves, but about the conditions that allowed them to remain undetected for so long. The fragmentation of reports. The absence of sustained coordination. The difficulty of recognizing patterns when they are distributed across time, geography, and circumstance. These are not failures of a single moment, but accumulations of small gaps that, together, create space for something larger to remain hidden. Understanding this does not provide closure. It provides context. And context is different from resolution. Even the demolition of number 25, Cromwell Street, did not function as an ending in the emotional sense. Physically, the structure was removed, its materials cleared, its presence erased from the landscape. But removal of form is not removal of meaning. The absence of the building became, in itself, a form of presence. People knew what had stood there. They knew what had been discovered. The space carried that knowledge even in its emptiness. Over time, however, the intensity of attention shifted elsewhere. New cases emerged, new stories captured public focus. This is the nature of collective memory, it does not remain fixed on a single point indefinitely. But certain cases, particularly those that challenge fundamental assumptions about safety and normality, do not fully recede. They remain in circulation, resurfacing whenever similar patterns appear elsewhere, or whenever discussions arise about how such events can be prevented. In that sense, the case continues to function. Not as an active investigation, but as a reference framework. A cautionary example. A reminder of what can exist beneath the surface of ordinary life. The legal outcomes remain part of that framework as well. The conviction of Rose West established accountability within the limits of the judicial system. The absence of a full trial for Fred West leaves a different kind of record, one shaped by evidence, admissions, and investigative reconstruction rather than courtroom adjudication. Together, these elements form a conclusion that is legal in nature but not exhaustive in meaning. Because no legal outcome can fully contain the emotional or human dimensions of what occurred. That is why the story persists. Not because it lacks an ending, but because endings in cases like this are not singular events. They are layered. There is the end of the investigation. The end of the trial. The end of the physical sight. And then there is the end that never fully arrives, the process of understanding, of integrating what has been learned into a broader view of how people interpret safety, trust, and the spaces they inhabit. In quieter moments, the case is no longer spoken of in terms of shock or discovery. It is spoken of in terms of reflection. What was missed? What could have been seen differently? What signs, in retrospect, appear more clearly than they did at the time? These conversations are not about assigning blame in a procedural sense, but about acknowledging the complexity of perception itself. Because perception is always incomplete. It relies on what is visible, what is reported, what is recognized as significant within a given moment. And the case of Cromwell Street demonstrates how easily that framework can fail when information is fragmented and signals are not immediately understood as connected. What remains, then, is awareness. Not constant fear, but a quieter form of attention. A recognition that appearances are not always sufficient indicators of reality. That understanding requires not only observation, but also the willingness to question what seems settled. And within that awareness, the victims of the case remain present, not as symbols of horror, but as individuals whose lives were intersected by circumstances that should never have unfolded as they did. Their stories form the most important part of the narrative, even when they are the quietest within it. In the end, the story does not close so much as it disperses. Into memory. Into systems. Into caution. Into the ongoing effort to understand how such events can be recognized earlier, responded to more effectively, and prevented in the future. And somewhere within that ongoing effort, the house on Cromwell Street continues to exist, not as a structure, but as a reminder. That even in the most ordinary places, the most ordinary appearances can hold histories that are anything but ordinary. And that understanding those histories is not just about looking back. It is about learning how to see more clearly moving forward. There is a final layer to every story like this, one that exists after the facts have been established, after the courtrooms have gone quiet, after the physical spaces have been erased or changed beyond recognition. It is the layer where memory settles, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing presence that continues to shape how people understand what they thought they already knew about the world. In the years following the disappearance of number 25, Cromwell Street in Gloucester, the physical absence of the house did not diminish its significance. If anything, the removal sharpened it. Without the structure to look at, without the tangible reminder of brick and mortar, people were left with something more abstract but more persistent, the knowledge of what had taken place there, and the discomfort that knowledge created. The names associated with the case, Fred West and Rose West, became shorthand for a kind of horror that resists easy categorization. Not because the legal process failed to define responsibility, but because the circumstances themselves extended beyond simple explanation. The case became a reference point not just for crime, but for the limits of perception, the fragility of assumptions, and the ways in which ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary realities. Over time, public memory of the case shifted in a way that is familiar with many historic investigations. The intensity of immediate attention faded, replaced by a more reflective awareness. The details remained, but they were no longer constantly present in daily conversation. Instead, they resurfaced periodically, when similar cases were reported, when discussions of investigative reform arose, or when questions about safeguarding and early detection returned to public discourse. But even in periods of quiet, the case never fully disappeared. It continued to exist in professional training, in criminological study, in discussions about systemic gaps in how missing persons cases are handled. It became part of a broader framework used to examine how information can exist in fragments across different systems without being connected in time to prevent further harm. These analyses did not change what had already happened, but they shaped how future cases were approached. For those directly affected, however, the passage of time followed a different rhythm. The families of the victims did not experience the case as a closed chapter. Instead, they lived with its continuation in a different form. Answers provided by investigation and trial brought clarity, but clarity is not the same as resolution. Knowing what happened does not restore what was lost. It only defines the absence more precisely. Each victim represented a life that had extended beyond the moment it was interrupted. That fact remains central even when the details of the case are discussed in forensic or procedural terms. The individuals who were identified through the investigation were not defined by the conditions of their deaths alone. They were people whose histories existed independently of the events that brought them into public awareness. That distinction matters because it resists the reduction of identity to circumstance. In the broader reflection on the case, this becomes one of the most important points. The danger of allowing narratives of violence to overshadow the humanity of those involved. The responsibility to remember not only what occurred, but who was affected by it in full, not just in part. In the decades since the trial, the case has also become part of a wider cultural understanding of how hidden crimes can exist within seemingly ordinary environments. It is referenced not for sensational detail, but for what it revealed about perception. The idea that safety is often assumed based on appearance rather than verified through deeper awareness. The assumption that proximity to normality guarantees absence of danger. These assumptions were challenged in a way that continues to resonate. Not because they were entirely wrong, but because they were incomplete. The house at Cromwell Street demonstrated that normality itself is not always a reliable indicator of underlying reality. That environments can appear stable while containing dynamics that are not visible to those outside them. And that recognition of such dynamics requires more than passive observation, it requires attention, communication, and the willingness to question when something does not align. As a result, the case has remained relevant in discussions about safeguarding, particularly in contexts involving vulnerable individuals. It has contributed, indirectly but meaningfully, to shifts in how agencies approach reports of missing persons, how patterns are analyzed across time, and how seemingly isolated incidents are evaluated in relation to broader systems. These changes do not erase what happened. They exist alongside it. Which is often how lasting impact operates, not as replacement, but as accumulation. New understanding layered over older failures, forming a structure of knowledge that is always incomplete but continually evolving. And yet, despite all analysis, despite all reflection, there remains something about the case that resists full resolution. Not in terms of facts, but in terms of emotional comprehension. The difficulty of fully integrating the idea that something so extensive could occur within such an unremarkable setting for so long without earlier interruption. That gap between knowledge and intuition is part of why the case continues to be revisited. In that sense, Cromwell Street is no longer just a location. It is a conceptual space within public memory. A point where questions about visibility, trust, and recognition converge. A reminder that understanding is not always immediate, and that absence of clarity in the present does not always mean absence of risk. The physical structure is gone. The street has returned to its ordinary rhythm. Life continues in the area in ways that no longer visibly reflect what once occurred there. But the absence of the house does not equate to absence of meaning. Instead, what remains is a kind of echo. Not loud. Not constant. But persistent enough to influence how similar situations are perceived elsewhere. And perhaps that is where the final layer of this story settles, not in resolution, but in awareness. A recognition that the world is composed of spaces that are not always as simple as they appear. And that understanding those spaces, truly understanding them, is not a single moment of discovery, but an ongoing responsibility carried forward long after the story itself has ended. There are stories that close with a sense of completion, where every thread is tied off and nothing remains unresolved. This is not one of them. The case of Cromwell Street, and everything connected to Fred West and Rose West, does not end in that way. It ends in a different register, one where answers exist, but understanding remains partial, where facts are established, but meaning continues to unfold long after the official record has been written. In Gloucester, the street itself no longer carries the physical weight of what once stood there. The house at number 25 has been erased from the landscape, its absence filled by ordinary space, ordinary life. People pass through without stopping, without necessarily thinking about what happened beneath that ground years ago. And yet, even in that normality, there is a kind of memory embedded in the wider awareness of the place. Not visible, not spoken constantly, but present nonetheless. That is how these stories persist. Not as constant reminders, but as latent knowledge. Something that resurfaces when triggered by similar events elsewhere, or when the mind returns to the question of how such a thing could have happened in the first place. The official record of the case is clear in its structure. Investigations were conducted. Evidence was gathered. The courts reached conclusions based on that evidence. The legal system, with all its procedures and limitations, did what it is designed to do. It defined responsibility within the framework available to it. But what the legal system cannot do is fully translate human experience into closure. That gap is where the story continues to live. Because behind every procedural outcome are people whose lives were shaped in ways that cannot be reversed. The individuals whose remains were recovered from the site are not defined by that moment alone. Their identities extend beyond the circumstances that brought them into public awareness. They were people with histories that did not begin or end with the investigation. And remembering that is essential if the story is to remain grounded in reality rather than reduced to abstraction. The impact on families is not something that concludes with a verdict. It evolves. It changes form over time, but it does not disappear. The knowledge gained through investigation replaces uncertainty, but it does not replace absence. What was lost remains lost. What was revealed cannot be undone. And the passage of time does not convert that into something easier, only something different. In the broader social context, the case continues to exist as a point of reference. Not because it is unique in the existence of crime, but because of what it revealed about perception. The assumption that ordinary environments are inherently safe. The belief that warning signs are always visible. The expectation that danger announces itself in ways that can be easily recognized. All of these assumptions were challenged in a way that left a lasting imprint on public understanding. This is why the case is still studied, still discussed, still referenced in conversations about investigative practice and systemic awareness. Not as a singular anomaly, but as an example of how fragmentation in information, combined with assumptions about normality, can create spaces where serious harm remains undetected for extended periods of time. It is also why the names remain embedded in public consciousness, even as time moves forward. Not because they are frequently spoken, but because they are not easily forgotten once encountered. They become part of a broader framework of reference, used cautiously, often reluctantly, when trying to understand similar patterns in other contexts. And yet, even with all of this analysis, there remains a part of the story that resists full integration into explanation. That resistance is not found in the evidence. It is found in the human response to it. The difficulty of reconciling ordinary appearance with extraordinary reality. The difficulty of accepting that systems of daily life can exist alongside hidden structures that operate without detection for years. That tension does not resolve easily, because it is rooted not only in this case, but in the broader way people interpret the world around them. As time continues to move forward, Cromwell Street becomes less a physical location and more a conceptual marker. A reference point for discussions about visibility, vulnerability, and the limits of perception. It exists in reports, in training materials, in academic analysis, and in the quiet background of public awareness whenever similar cases emerge. But beyond institutional memory, there is also a quieter form of remembrance. The recognition that behind every case file, every investigative report, every legal conclusion, there are human lives that cannot be fully captured in documentation. Lives that were lived before they were examined. Lives that mattered outside of the circumstances that brought them into focus. That recognition is what gives the story its final weight. Not the details of the crimes alone, but the understanding of what was interrupted, what was lost, and what cannot be restored. And so the case remains, not as an active investigation, and not as a closed chapter, but as something in between. A completed legal process that continues to carry unresolved human resonance. A finished narrative that still prompts reflection. A known history that still shapes how uncertainty is interpreted in the present. There is no final revelation that changes everything. No concluding insight that resolves every question. Only a gradual deepening of understanding over time, shaped by distance, reflection, and the persistence of memory. And in that space, the story of Cromwell Street continues, not because it is unfinished, but because it cannot be reduced to a point where it no longer requires thought. It remains as a reminder that understanding is never absolute. And that even when a case is closed, its meaning continues to evolve in the minds of those who encounter it, long after the last page of the official record has been turned.